All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most astonishing success stories in all of human history. We're going to really look at the sheer, mind-boggling scale of the Roman Empire at its absolute peak, and decode the precise mechanisms, the nuts and bolts, that explain exactly how Rome turned to be the strongest empire the ancient world had ever seen.
You know, it's wild when you really think about it. Rome didn't just pop into existence as this sprawling, pre-packaged superpower. Not at all. It began around the 8th century BC as just a tiny, unremarkable village draining a marshy valley right there on the Tiber River. Yet, somehow, it evolved into an absolute juggernaut of global dominance. We're talking territory stretching from the ring-swept coasts of Britain all the way to the sun-baked deserts of Arabia. So how does a single city pull that off?
Well, to really wrap our heads around the scale of their achievement, let's look at this staggering number, 90 million. That represents the high-end estimate of the empire's peak population in 117 AD. To put that into perspective for a second, the Romans were governing roughly 20% of the entire world's population at the time. Literally 1 in 5 human beings on Earth lived under Roman law, walked on Roman roads, and used Roman coins. It's just unbelievable.
So how exactly did they do it? Here's our roadmap for today. 1. A modest beginning. 2. The military machine. 3. Conquering the Mediterranean. 4. Engineering an empire. And finally, 5. The Roman legacy. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1. A modest beginning. From Palatine Hill to a thriving republic. If we look way back at the 8th century BC, Rome's actual founding is kind of shrouded in the whole myth of Romulus and Remus. And for over 2 centuries, it was an elective monarchy. But then, in 509 BC, the Romans did something totally radical. They kicked out their last king and established a republic. This was a system of checks, balances, and elected magistrates, and that republic lasted nearly 500 years. That is, until 27 BC, when Augustus centralized power, kicking off the empire phase, which just kept expanding until it hit its geographic peak in 117 AD under Emperor Trajan. But honestly, the road to the top was anything but easy. Just listen to this. With iron, not with gold, Rome buys her freedom. General Camillus dropped that dramatic line back in 390 BC, right after the Gauls had sacked Rome and demanded this massive ransom in gold. According to the histories, when the Romans noticed the Gauls using rigged scales to weigh the ransom, they didn't complain. They drew their swords instead. It perfectly captures that aggressive, resilient mindset that would define the Roman approach to any existential threat. They never just rolled over. They adapted, and they fought back hard.
Moving on to Section 2, the military machine. Innovation in ancient warfare.
So Rome's military transformation was frankly revolutionary. They actually started out using a traditional Greek hoplite model. You know, rigid, tightly packed phalanxes made up of property-owning farmers who basically fought defensively and then just went back home to their crops. But Rome quickly realized this rigid formation wasn't going to cut it against faster, more unpredictable enemies. So they completely changed the game. They ditched the rigid phalanx and moved to professional legions using highly flexible tactics, transforming into an aggressively oriented, paid standing army.
Let's break down exactly how they got that massive edge. First off, they organized their troops into monopoles. These were smaller, super agile units of about 120 men that could maneuver independently on really complex terrain. Then, late in the Republic, a general named Gaius Marius changed everything. He started recruiting landless, poor men, completely professionalizing the whole shebang. Later on, Emperor Augustus locked in a fixed size of 28 permanent standing legions. They also mixed cavalry and infantry units together and very strategically utilized allied barbarian troops known as foederati. By making the shift to a professional, paid standing army, Rome basically turned its military into a relentless, year-round conquering machine.
Which brings us to Section 3, Conquering the Mediterranean. Carthage, Assimilation, and Strategic Expansion.
Right, so in the 3rd century BC, Rome's expansion literally collides with Carthage, which was the dominant maritime power in the Western Mediterranean at the time. The only problem? Rome had pretty much zero navy, no ships, so they improvise. They rapidly build up fleets and invent this boarding device called a corvus. They essentially turned a naval battle into a giant hand-to-hand infantry brawl because, well, they definitely preferred fighting on solid ground. And it worked brilliantly. This innovation ultimately led to the destruction of Carthage and secured Rome's very first overseas territories.
Now, all this rapid conquest brought some really profound domestic changes. By the late Republic, enslaved people made up an estimated 40% of the population in the city of Rome and around 20% across the entire empire.
This massive influx of wealth and captive labor totally upended the Roman economy. It pushed the small, free yeoman farmers completely out of business, which fueled the rise of these massive, ultra-wealthy private agricultural estates known as latifundia.
But here is where Rome did something that was just completely unheard of for an ancient conqueror. Fast forward a bit to 212 AD, and we see the Edict of Caracalla. This edict granted full Roman citizenship to almost all free men living anywhere in the empire. Most conquerors back then simply extracted tribute and kept their subjects suppressed as outsiders, right? Not Rome. They actively assimilated their subjects. By extending citizenship, they legally turned former enemies into stakeholders of the empire, effectively cementing loyalty across a vast, multicultural domain.
Okay, moving to Section 4, Engineering and Empire, the power of infrastructure and logistics.
We've all heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome. Well, they didn't just happen by accident. Building them was this rigorous, highly standardized four-step process. First, they'd survey routes to be as absolutely straight and efficient as possible. Then, they dug deep to lay solid foundations with proper drainage, which is literally the secret to their longevity. Third, they paved the surfaces with super durable stone. And finally, they established way stations and horse relays all along the routes. By systematically building this vast network, Rome ensured their legions could deploy rapidly in any season. It really proves that logistics were just as vital to their supremacy as swords. And this logistical genius extended straight into their cities. The Romans were absolute technological marvels. Take the 3rd century BC. They invent Roman concrete, or pozzolana. This was a volcanic ash mixture that was incredibly strong. It could even set underwater. They also built 11 major aqueducts stretching over 450 kilometers combined just to supply fresh drinking water to the capital. They had massive public baths, indoor plumbing, and complex sewer systems like the Cloaca Maxima. These engineering marvels allowed Roman urban centers to safely support massive, dense populations that wouldn't be seen again in Europe until the Industrial Revolution.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, the Roman Legacy, Blueprints for the Modern World.
So why on earth does all this ancient history matter so much to you and me today? Well, the answer starts right here, with the Latin phrase res publica. Literally translated, it means public business. This was the conceptual foundation of the Roman Republic, a mixed constitutional system featuring elected magistrates, a senate, and representative assemblies. Even though Rome eventually fell into an autocracy under the emperors, this foundational concept of the Republic survived. It went on to create the very DNA for modern Western political systems, heavily inspiring the founders of modern republics like the United States and France.
And honestly, that legacy extends far beyond just government. Think about our legal systems. We still use concepts like the veto, right? And we base so much of our civil law codes straight on Roman foundations. Look at language. Vulgar Latin evolved into the Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and deeply influenced English. In infrastructure, the use of concrete, the architectural arch, and vast highway networks absolutely set the standard for civil engineering. From the letters we write, to the legal codes we follow, to the way our cities are paved and plumbed, the Roman blueprint is literally built into our everyday lives.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer today, and I really want to leave you with a question to chew on. We've just seen how Rome turned to be the strongest empire through military innovation, strategic assimilation, and staggering engineering. But looking at our world right now, are today's global superpowers following that Roman blueprint for success? Or are they making the exact same mistakes? Internal division, economic polarization, and overexpansion that led to its inevitable fall. I'll leave you to ponder that provocative thought, because understanding how the strongest empire rose might just be the absolute key to understanding our own future. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.